Don't take the status quo as given, is what they were just talking about. Change for your benefit. Our panel is going to discuss exactly that with the rise of geoeconomics. And what a panel we have. Next to me is Excellency Sebastian Kurz, the former Federal Chancellor of Austria. Freudian slip there. Next to him, the Right Honourable Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister of Canada. Tsai, the CEO and founding partner of 500 Global. André Esteves, the Senior Partner and Chairman of Banco BTG Pactual. Nyatta is the co-founder of Bicycle Capital. Edith Yeung is the General Partner from Race Capital. And with us, of course, Daniel Yergin, the Vice Chair of S&P Global. I start with you, Daniel. The decision for sanctions, and let's take Russia, Ukraine. The decision to sanction in such a way, forcing companies to withdraw. How many of those companies do you think would have stayed if they hadn't been forced to leave?
Richard, I think it's about 3,000 companies that have left, and I think probably all 3,000 of them would have stayed. But I think what it represents is the most dramatic example of how we've come to the end of a 30-year era of globalization, and we're entering a new period of a more fragmented world.
With that in mind, Stephen Harper, the decision by governments to force that element of change isn't taken lightly, but it is part of the responsibility. What factors go into that decision from your view?
Well, first of all, just before I answer that, Richard, let me just thank the Kingdom for hosting me here. It's always great to come here, and this is a real bright spot in the world, and this conference just gets bigger and better every year, so I'm delighted to be here. Look, I think, it's a combination of things. My country, Canada, was a little bit different. We essentially severed our economic relationship with Russia after the invasion of Crimea in 2014. It was our judgment. A couple of things led to that. One is that, we have an enormous Ukrainian community, and support for Ukraine in Canada is literally 100% of the political spectrum. But also it was the judgment of our government that Vladimir Putin represented a serious long-term geopolitical threat to the West, to our societies. And so we wanted to get out in front of that particular dynamic.
And when you do so, you basically do it in a way that it forces companies to withdraw.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I always took the following position with regard to Canadian companies who were active around the world. It was that if you are in places and doing business that is consistent with the national interests and foreign policy objectives of the Government of Canada, we will do everything we can to assist you. But if you are not, you are on your own, and the government will not aid you commercially if you're on the wrong side of a geopolitical situation. So those are the kind of risks companies have to take into account. And in my judgment, Richard, the companies who withdrew, I'm not saying they didn't believe it was the right thing, but they have withdrawn because there was no alternative.
André, from the banking side, you stand to get caught in the middle, don't you?
Yes, but I would say that this topic, you have two layers of discussion. One, where the corporations are price takers, not price makers, right? Well, you need to do what you need to do. And the second layer of this discussion is related to stakeholder capitalism, where you need to follow those around you, no matter if they are customers, regulators, counterparts, and what they expect to you.
But how far do you take stakeholder capitalism when it comes to the issue of geoeconomics?
Yeah.
How far do you take stakeholder?
I think it's enormous, right? Because this kind of, the expression is new, but the behavior is not new, right? You need to follow the demands of, as I said, your customers, your counterparts, your regulators, everybody that what we call a society, independent of the rules that are imposed. Before the rules, you need your behavior. So I think under this umbrella, the global corporations will take much more decisions, and sometimes in advance than regulators, based on what people and on a broad sense expect from them.
But Christine, if you look, I mean, I guess if you're sending trucks and minerals, it's one thing. If you are doing tech, it's something different because there isn't the same infrastructure costs necessarily associated. But the damage can be greater in many ways. So when geopolitics comes into investment decisions, how difficult is it?
For 500 Global, it's a very good question because we are a global firm. We invest in technology companies, typically as oftentimes one of their first institutional investors. And because of that, we certainly have a purview over many countries around the world. With geopolitics, especially in the private sector, in many cases, we were talking about this backstage, it's relatively straightforward in terms of sanctions. Obviously, we can't invest or we can't be active in the region, but I think you don't even have to get to the level of that to still be part of that conversation and be mindful of founders that we are backing in many markets around the world, and it's something that we do need to navigate.
Right, but what's your threshold? I mean, is your threshold, if we take, for instance, the peak is sanctions, Iran, you can't do it, so don't even bother thinking about it. And you take at the bottom a country that just has a bad human rights record, or has, the governments don't like it, or the governments are not on good terms. Somewhere between the two, where do you fit? Where do you add that value?
Again, we know our portfolio spans more than 80 countries around the world, so there's the whole spectrum of that, even below the sanctions point. So, but that is how we have been investing for 12 years. And I don't think that's I think that's only going to increase. And largely for us, we do try to separate governments from people in terms of the founders that we work with. They are still building things.
That's fine, separating governments from people. Can you do that, Xu? Can you separate in that way?
Well, so Christine invests very early in companies. I invest a little later in companies in Latin America. And it's a very schizophrenic business when it comes to your question. Because we're either the friend of the government or the foe of the government, depending on what the companies do. Our companies change things. It's what they do. We invest in change. And change is either fighting against incumbents or helping more people be included. And the first case, people like André hate it. In the second case, governments tend to really love what these companies are doing, bringing people into the financial services ecosystem, et cetera. So it's a very schizophrenic job to be supporting these young founders whose job is to change the status quo, because you could end up on one side or the other of the geoeconomic debate. It's not always clear a priori.
Right, but do you look at that when making the decision? In a private conversation in your offices, do you hear somebody say, the government hates them, or they're going to have trouble because government doesn't really like them?
We're agnostic. We look at the founder and the ability of that founder to catalyze change. And then if they're going into war, we go into war with them.
You do?
Yeah.
Chancellor, you're hearing the investors talk, but government sees things differently. And no amount of wanting a rosy scenario, when you make the decisions, you have to look at it in a different way.
Well, I don't think in a different way, because I don't think that you can divide government from people or government from the private sector. But of course, regarding to the sanctions, if a country invades another country on our continent, there was the necessity for the European Union to react, and the European Union did it with sanctions. So I think it was an absolutely understandable decision in these days. What is important is whenever you implement sanctions, that means that you should do it in a way that your opponent is hit harder than you are hit yourself. And
So on that point, at the moment,
Well,
do you think Russia is being hit? I know this isn't strictly on this, but since you've raised it, do you think Russia is being hit harder than the EU?
I think that that Russia is definitely hit hard, and I think that everybody who says that the Russian economy is not suffering is wrong, especially kicking them out from SWIFT hurt them a lot, but you're right. On the other hand, the high energy costs, they are a major problem for the European Union at the moment, but nobody in Europe wanted this war. The EU did not want this war, so I think it was a necessity to react and to impose sanctions.
Edith, on the one hand, listening to this, business investors, we have the politicians over here, we have the investors over there, somewhere in the middle of the bankers and the experts. How difficult does it make it?
Well, first off, coming from somebody who invests in early stage technology, I think, very similar to Christine, we don't take any side.
Why not?
Because the most important thing is that all the founders, particularly early stage tech, no one think that they can do business as usual. In fact, they want to define new category. In 2019, very, very honored, I got the chance to invest in a company called FTX. It's one of the world's largest crypto derivative exchange. The founder CEO take a very deliberate approach, go to Washington, D.C., Sam, really help the US government to define, to set regulations and policy for trading digital asset. If you think about it, sort of related to this particular conversation with the Ukraine war, basically there's no banking, right? So a lot of the activities is basically funded by crypto, and there's no internet access. Starlink, which is supported by Elon, basically let the country to continue to have internet access. So in some sense, technology is really at the forefront for any countries that want to stay as leadership regardless of financials or continue to run the country.
Edith, thank you for reminding me about Starlink and Elon Musk. I'd forgotten for a moment about that. But Daniel, that's an example, isn't it, of a company well and truly stuck in the middle of geopolitics. He offers Starlink, Musk offers Starlink to all in Ukraine, and then 6 months on, the $20 million bill comes in per month, and then he says he's not, and now he says basically, oh, go on, you can have it free. Is that a way for any company to be run?
Well, I think that's a very special company with a special leader. But I think it really, there are two different forces that we're talking about here. One is the integrative force of technology bringing things together. But I think the fundamental thing we're dealing with is that everybody in the last 30 years has been part of what I've called the WTO consensus, the World Trade Organization, all in it together. And I was thinking about this at the IMF World Bank meeting. When you were there in 2008, it was a bad time. US and China were working together. Now the US and China aren't working together at all. And the fundamental issue is what's happening between the United States and China and this breakdown. And I'll just mention it in one dimension. Supply chains. Supply chains were about efficiency. And they were incredibly complex. And now they're being revised dramatically in terms of national security, resilience, all of those things. And companies are really struggling is how do you have global supply chains when you have this kind of confrontation between the world's two largest economies?
Right, but what do you do? I mean, what does the company want? Does the company, one of our investors chime in or bankers chime in, do you want government to blithely move forward, blinkered to what they believe of policy wrongs elsewhere? Continue regardless because business must be done? Or do you end up with a US-China type relationship where the US says, no, it's not in our national interests? Let's take you, André.
Oh, I think you have different levels of this kind of geopolitical challenge, right? People can like, people can dislike, but you have the forbidden stories and the dislike stories, right? And I think corporations, as I said, they should obey the regulation, they should follow their stakeholders. So it's more or less that's the pocket rule. But having said that, and going back to Daniel's answer, I think we have a much more macroeconomic consequence of the geopolitical situation that you described. We all here, including all of us in this room, we collected fully the peace dividend of the last 30 years, right? Since the Berlin Wall fall, we all collected this amazing optimization in global economy and global societies coming from the reorganization of supply chain, driven by just one, or almost one only variable, which is efficiency, which was quite good, reduced poverty around the world in many regions, but probably this moment is over. And we'll need to face a different economic consequence on that. The most important one is reduction in productivity, which means probably a higher inflationary environment.
You see, I like the way you go back to the economics of it, and yourself, Daniel, you take it. But Stephen Harper, Canada found with China over the extradition of the Huawei executive, Canada found itself well and truly stuck in the middle between the US and China. A gold standard judicial system in Canada that could not, quote, do a dirty deal to sort it out because the courts wouldn't allow it, and a government that really was left thinking, how the hell did we get into this mess in the first place?
Yeah, it was a very tough situation, eventually resolved, but with a lot of blood on the floor and a lot of bad publicity for the government. Look, Richard, what I would say all of this falls under, whether we're talking about governments or business, what we are witnessing right now is what I call the end of naive globalism. In the post-Cold War period, an assumption developed among business and governments that differences in governance and rivalries between different forms of governance in the world were somehow a declining or negligible business risk issue. And what we have found out in the last 5 years with Russia and Ukraine, with the pandemic, et cetera, this is simply not true. And when it comes to we have to shorten supply chains, we have to reintroduce redundancy, and you go through the list, and we have to be very careful how we manage competing geopolitical pressures. These risks are real, have to be taken into account, and we have to have plans in advance for how to manage situations like the Huawei situation.
Can I add one layer of complexity to this? We're talking a lot about physical supply chains. They're relatively easy to manage and prevent and control. Digital supply chains exist now too, and examples are TikTok. It's a purely digital global supply chain controlled in China. Shein in China, Binance in China. These are huge companies that reach into the rest of the world and dramatically influence the situation on the ground. And what do you do about those? How do you ban digital supply chains? Do you try and control them? It's much more difficult to do than physical supply chains.
Right, and on that point, you then get to the stage where you ban TikTok or its parent company. You look at, for instance, I am, and I freely admit it, although I should be ashamed, an investor in Didi, and I'm now even wondering where my shares are, never mind anything else, having watched them go down to all of $1 on some weird exchange somewhere. What is the responsibility, Christine and then Edith, what is the responsibility of investors when faced with these situations, do you think? First to you.
Well, there's a good reason why I'm not in the public sector and in the private sector in terms of a lot of these. But I mean, with the companies that we work with, I think Shu's point is very much valid. That a lot of the discussions right now are about the politics and countries. But you know, for us, what we see on the ground is technology is obviously operates much faster and it's a lot different.
Right, but let's take
access and
let's just take, for example, the US's latest promulgation on chips, digital chips, that basically has clobbered many companies, and I'm guessing in the process clobbered startups that are working in the area that were hoping to attract business there. Either of you?
yeah.
Well, I think the situation with the chipset is super interesting. I think the US is even stopping people who have a green card or US passport to stop working in Chinese companies. And I think one of the things that I do want to encourage... And
Do you agree with that?
I don't think that is the right way to go. And I actually think that as an investor, which is not qualified to set any regulatory or have the background, is not necessarily trying to regulate the how, is to really emphasize what's the end result. Because in technology, there's a lot of cause and effect. It's not about a whack-a-mole. I see certain things, I'm going to stop it. There's a cause and effect of many, many things that all work together. But with this particular situation with China is US, if China retaliate, this is not more than just technology. Tesla actually make more cars in Shanghai than they do in California. It will really go back to all the American companies, and which is driving tons of revenue, and it will really impact financial sector later on.
That goes to the heart of this whole issue, though, doesn't it? When does government, let's hear from government side, when does government have to say, we would like to do this, but we dare not because our companies will be hit? Or we will do it anyway, and our companies will just have to deal with the consequences? That's the sort of governmental decision you have to take.
Yeah, and I think it's necessary to be always honest about that. I think there's no upside without the downside. It's the same in business as in government. And I think the most important thing is to be honest to the people and to explain that, for example, sanctions can be a necessity, or there is no better alternative than that. But at the same time, it of course has a downside.
Right, but that sanctions is, as we've all agreed, sanctions is almost the ultimate option in a sense. I'm just talking about bad relations. Yeah, I'm talking about an industrial policy.
I think from my point of view, that's pretty clear. My opinion is that unfortunately, at the moment we are going in the wrong direction. I was always happy to live on a planet in a world of globalization. And at the moment, I think what we have is not only the war in Ukraine, we also have the trend of decoupling. And coming from Austria, a country which is very export-orientated, of course, these developments cannot be positive, because in the end, such developments will lead to a fact that you have smaller markets, and of course it will not be good for the economic development, at least not in our part of the world.
Yes, Daniel.
Well, I think Shu mentioned the digital supply chains. We've talked about the physical supply chains. There's one other aspect, which is the people's supply chains. And I was just thinking as this panel is going on the one hand, what you've mentioned, Edith, that U.S. passport holders cannot now work for Chinese chip companies. I think about 10 or 15 years ago, somebody in Silicon Valley said if you have a strategy for startup strategy, you have to think about your China strategy. Forget that. And I'm thinking about the education system of the U.S. That somebody said to me, 60-70% of the graduate students in physics and science in many U.S. universities come from China. That supply chain is going to be cut off too. So it is incremental that becoming, and I think with the chips, just listening to this panel, I think we'll be looking back on what's happened on chips in the last few weeks as maybe a dramatic example of a turning point that's now unfolding.
What Dan just said remind me of, we did a study last week at our own Raise Capital Venture Summit that talks about, because of all the geopolitical issues, we're seeing a migration of talent, people coming from Russia, Ukraine, China, to other countries like Singapore, the UAE, or the UK and Canada as a hotspot. So being somebody who's invested in early stage technology, we better, as an investor, we better get used to the fact that all our companies will be continuing to be distributed, because if I'm not able to operate in certain countries, the talent will migrate and they go somewhere else, and I need to be okay with it.
How do you, though, as a CEO, adapt? So last night on Questions Business, I had the CEO of a large retail investment in the region, and the owners of things like Carrefour in the region and those sort of things. And I said, and he's in Lebanon. They're in Lebanon, they're in East Africa. And I said, how do you manage that level of risk? How do you manage geopolitical changes? And he just said, you just do. But does that require, you just get used to the fact that in Venezuela you can't get your money out?
You don't need to go as far as Venezuela for that. In Argentina, you cannot.
Sorry?
In Argentina, you cannot get your money out. So I think it's just the anxiety or the challenge of the present CEOs. But if you go 50 years ago or 100 years ago, you also had their own geopolitical targets. Of course, as humanity evolves, our societies evolve, we have different sorts of complexities. We started talking about physical supply chain, technological supply chain, or people supply chain. But if you look at there is clear common denominator of friction in the system. No matter.
But there'll always be friction in the system. Yeah. What I'm suggesting is the friction is worse, the consequences are larger, and more people are prepared to take sides.
Right.
That's true. I mean, you've just described it.
So I think what's critical, Richard, for business, and what we advise, is don't wait for these things to happen. Evaluate these risks up front, figure out how you're going to manage them before you get hit with them. Most of them, by the way, are predictable. They're not entirely unpredictable. So you, as I say, we're in a different era, and you simply can't pretend that these geopolitical risks are going to go away.
But those companies, Prime Minister, those companies, CEOs are not only dealing with an onslaught of a recession.
Right.
If you're in the US, you will be dealing with deep polarization on political issues. You will also be dealing with social issues, everything from the does they gay in Florida to the bathrooms issues, whatever it is. There will be a range of CSR, for want of a better word, issues. And now, on top of that, you put geopolitical.
Right.
I think André said it well, that we've had a peace dividend. It's kind of been benign for 30 years, and that's just the new reality. And from a startup point of view, for example, there are companies in Brazil, young companies with CEOs who now have to think about how they fight China, use this moment in their favor to influence local politics, and that's just a new thing CEOs need to think about.
But I'm not going to let you get away with that, because one side will do the politics of saying, this is the right thing to do. This is our national interest. Business has, and I've covered business for a long time, says, no, we're just about business. It's almost like the sports theory, people who say, no, it's just all about sports. You're going to have to take sides. You're going to have to make a decision. You're going to have to take a moral judgment.
I don't think it's moral. I think you do have to take sides, but I think moral stays out of it. No one frames it that way, at least in the business world.
Russia-Ukraine, you'd frame it that way.
But if you're running an individual business, you say, what's in my interest? I think we're in an era of shrewdness. We're past the era of faith and trust in each other, and we're in an era of shrewdness. And so you have to look for your interests as a business and be very specific about what that entails and where you should fight and where you shouldn't.
Yeah, but what happens when the phrase you have to use is, it's the right thing to do? Because on Russia-Ukraine, one of the questions I've asked CEOs again and again is when when Russia opens up again, and even though the sanctions won't go for years, but when Russia opens up, how quickly will you go back? And companies usually have a rubric now when the time is right, which means nothing.
Well, I think they'll go back cautiously. I don't think it's not going to feel like it did when the Soviet Union collapsed and sort of companies got very excited. I think people will be quite cautious and want to see what is, let's say, a different Russia is and how's the government worked out, and by the way, how chaotic is it?
I think sins are forgiven very quickly. I think sins are forgiven very quickly.
Yeah. I think particularly because we on the technology side we invest in very, very small companies, and if early stage companies all they think about is working with, they don't even have money or revenue or enough funding to lobby to hire lawyers sometimes. So, but when the companies get to a certain size, and the reason why I bring up FTX is 5 million users now is basically the population of Singapore. Now they have enough funding to actually work with government and be very open and take the social responsibility to help and define policy and regulation.
I would suggest to you that for those companies that are too small, nascent, or naive, that's your job.
Absolutely.
So you're the people who have to say, actually, you really do need to be very careful about this in this country, and we don't think you should do this in this country, and this country is going to be a real headache, and I would steer clear.
And that's why a lot of the early stage companies, when they first started, they stay in their home country. They actually don't have the luxury to go overseas because, frankly, it takes a lot and costly to work in so many countries all at once.
Yeah, they don't have the capital. They're just trying to get to product market fit. They're trying not to run out of money. But I think also what Edith and Shu mentioned in terms of, especially where we sit at the early stage, I mean, the geopolitics, there's not much in our own control, but certainly what we see increasingly, and I think, as Shu pointed out, this is really the new normal for CEOs, whether they're an early stage company or a public company, is the social issues that it's very increasingly difficult to not have a position. You can certainly be like Coinbase and say we are not going to take any position in the company. We're just going to focus on the company. But you know that is also a strong position, but people won't like that. But it's just that is the new normal in terms of whether it's geopolitics or social issues that CEOs are under that pressure to either take a position or take action.
Here's the unique part about companies. They are in a powerful position because they influence economic activity. And so in the social environment, when you get companies saying we're not going to invest in X, or we are going to disinvest in Y because of in the country because of a policy, that can be very powerful.
Yeah, but it's good that it is like it is, because I think it's good that we live in a diverse world with different approaches and different views, and people and politicians and governments have the power to take decisions, but also companies have the power to take decisions, and sometimes their decisions are even better than the decisions of politicians. So I think that's not a problem at all.
Stephen, when you were in government, did you sometimes despair at companies or want to ring the CEO up and say, what the hell are you doing? Why are you doing that and making government's life more difficult?
The answer is yes. That crossed my mind more than once, and I can say on occasion I actually did that very thing. You were really.
Were you ever told, mind your own business? You're the prime minister. I'll run my own company.
No, because you don't call them to lecture. You call to really have an exchange and kind of figure out what they're thinking and why, and give them a better sense of what the government is thinking. So, in a free society, if you do it correctly, it's a dialogue you establish, and I think it's important that governments do it, the governments become informed of why businesses are doing what they're doing, but likewise, businesses take into account what the government's broader social concerns may be.
Daniel.
So I think we have two big case studies right now. One is Russia and one is China, for at least American or Western companies. On Russia, I think it became pretty clear that there was great social pressure, that companies could not take a wait-and-see attitude. Dock workers were refusing to unload things and so forth. And so I think pretty quickly the decision became, even for people who had multi-billion-dollar investments, you better unwind pretty quickly. I think on China, what I observe of CEOs, again, not speaking of all CEOs, but US, Western CEOs, it's trying to figure out exactly the question you're posing. How do you navigate? Is this going to get worse? And how do you avoid, as the regulations mount here and the regulations mount here, how do you avoid making a mistake and getting caught in a way that's very difficult?
But also within that, Daniel, you've not only got CEOs, the government, you've got shareholders. Yes. Climate change. You heard in the last panel, they were talking about the inability to finance hydrocarbon projects. Now, that's activism rather than geopolitical tensions, but the geopolitical tensions create the activism, which then create the pressure from shareholders.
Yeah, well, certainly, and that activism, obviously, as you get to hydrocarbons, a lot of activism around that. And I think it was a lot of shareholder pressure, actually, that pushed companies to say, we're getting out of Russia pretty quickly. Can we move our people? Can we get them to Dubai? Can we get them to Astana?
A few minutes left. I guess the thing I want to emphasize most to our guests in the room is that this is not a theoretical discussion. This is not some think tank discussion that doesn't have relevance to what you will have to decide on a daily basis. Would you agree, Shu, that this is actual? Now, you may not think of it every moment, but this comes to bite you in the most unexpected ways.
Yeah, so I think there are two realms in which that may be true or false. One is your local business that you're trying to build and the advantages you're trying to create as a company so that you can endure. And in those cases, you are thinking about it all the time, every day. How do I get an edge? How is China's weakness going to be my strength? But I think on this broader topic of you have to take a side, you have to take a moral position, I don't think a lot of people running companies in many parts of the world care. I think that is theoretical and is kind of a Western obsession of we need to pick a side and decide what the right thing is in this context. In a lot of places, people just want to run their business and build some value, and they don't really care about the moral side.
I think as an investor, we should advise our founders and CEO to think about, let's say, if I invest in a Saudi company, where they set up does not necessarily equal to where they're going to serve, and also where they eventually going to exit. Should it be China or US and Hong Kong? And who should they partner and where did they locate it? And we obviously need to respect various sanction laws. So our role is really as an advisor and sounding board for our CEO to make the decision, regardless of where they set up, where they serve, where they partner, and where they eventually exit.
What's your responsibility, André? Yours.
I think the moral issues, they become relevant when they involve the stakeholders of your company. So I think moral do matter because if your customer is worried, if your regulators are worried, if your counterparts are worried, you will take actions regarding that. But I do think, Richard, that the complexity changed in terms of the geoeconomics, but it was always here with us. During the Second World War, a lot of CEOs were thinking about the same issues that we are thinking now. How I separate business, should import components of Germany or not, I should do business or not. The size of the problems and the complexity changed, but it's not new.
So it's not new, Christine, but you're still going to have to deal with it. Where do you stand?
Yeah, I definitely think that for leaders, I mean, Shu does have a good point in terms of, by and large, there are many, many businesses out there where they just want to run their business. But I do think that this is not going to get easier. The complexities have existed for many, many decades. They're just changing, and maybe it seems more intense because things are more uncertain. But they're going to continue, and CEOs will need to have clear values for their company and know where they stand.
Chancellor, are you looking forward to having to deal with these problems again back in government?
No. I'm in the private sector now and happy about this decision.
All right, so you'll have to make these decisions from the private sector. You'll be against government.
No, I think they're like my colleague described it. I think in our societies it's good that there are different opinions, and sometimes you go in line with the opinions of the government, and sometimes you don't.
Prime Minister, the moral question. It's not often one puts moral in the word of government and companies in the same sentence, but the moral dimension is what?
Well, look, the moral dimension is important. I just summarize it this way for businesses, Richard. Moral, social, political, geopolitical issues. You're in business nowadays, you're going to be hit with these things. You better figure out, in terms of your stakeholder your universe, what side, when do you have to take a side? And when you have to take a side, you take a side. When you don't have to take a side, don't take a side, because you're going to be hit with enough controversies without going out and creating some yourself.
An excellent piece of advice. Don't take a side unless you have to, and if you don't have to, try not to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel, thank you.